Let's jump into the Words of Radiance recap, chapter by chapter for part 2. So we start off with Shallan, and she's on her way to the Shattered Plains, and she's talking to Pattern, and he tells her that the Voidbringers are coming, that the Spren of him are coming. Then we go to an Adolin POV, and he's prepping for a duel, and we hear from him that Yasna and this ward are late. They're like a couple weeks late, but nobody's too concerned yet. Navani's like, oh, Yasna, she probably just got sidetracked. And then Adolin's preparing for his duel, and I just think it's funny to point out that he has a pre-duel ritual. So, like, before every duel, he makes sure he eats chicken, he talks to his sword, and he has his mother's necklace in his pocket. So anyway, he goes on to fight this duel. He beats the guy, like, brutally and very quickly. He gives the Shardblade to Renarin, and I just want to point out that Renarin grimaces when he grabs the Shardblade. We go back to Shallan, and she sends Pattern to eavesdrop on the men, and she finds out that they're planning to ransom her once they get to the Shattered Plains. Now, she can't have that, so she ends up telling the leader, like, hey, I'm coming into all this money. Once we get to the Shattered Plains, you will get your cut, of course. And he's, like, still kind of on the fence, she can tell, and so she doesn't realize it, but she uses, like, some stormlight to change her appearance, make herself look more, like, regal and authoritative. And then he, threatens him a little bit, and then he seems to come around. And then she notices afterwards too that like the wounds on her feet don't hurt as much. And then at the end of the chapter, we hear the men saying that there's another caravan nearby, and it could be bandits or mercenaries. We don't know. We check back in with Kaladin, and he's at the Light Eyes training grounds with some of his men, looking over Renarin and Adolin. And he's really stewing over Amaram, and Moash can tell. And Moash goes up to him, and he's basically like, we're going to get back at these people who've done these things to us, right? And he has like all these anger spread around him, and Kaladin nods, and we get the feeling like Moash definitely has baggage. And then Syl is talking to Kaladin, and she's like, come on, you have to admit Dalinar is not like Amaram. And he does agree, but still, And then Kaladin and Adolin kind of puff their chests up at each other, of course, like they always do. And then Syl mentions that she doesn't like anybody who carries shard blades. And Kaladin asks her what's up with that, and she's like, calls them abominations, but she says they weren't abominations when the Radiance held them. So he asks, like, well, where do shards come from? And she's not able to tell him. Then Kaladin sees someone kind of like sus in a shadowy corner, and he goes to talk to him, and he mentions he has like young eyes, old eyes, but young skin, and his name is Zahel. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. And I'll just say, if you haven't read Warbreaker, you should. Zahel starts training Renarin, and then afterwards, or during it, he's talking to Kaladin, and he offers to train Kaladin, and Kaladin's like, no, I don't want it. And then Adolin is talking his shit, and so Kaladin charges him, but Adolin's wearing full shard plates, so he throws off Kaladin, and Kaladin goes flying, and Zahel is tearing into Adolin like, you idiot, you could have killed him. And then Kaladin's stewing, and he infuses himself with stormlight, and he goes to charge at Adolin, and then all the stormlight drains from him, and he's afterwards he's like, what happened to Syl? And Syl was like, well, who were you trying to protect? We go back to Shallan, and we see this column of smoke in front of them, and then there's still that caravan behind, and so she tells her men to go towards that column of smoke. And then while they're doing that, she's talking to Pattern about these things that have been happening to her, and how she wishes she still had the book Yasna gave her, the Words of Radiance, but it's lost to sea now, and she's asking him how does she do it, and he tells her to eat the light. She figures it out to breathe in the stormlight, but she's not able to replicate what she's been doing. And then when she's talking to Pattern more, she realizes that he's a scholar of the Spren, and he's like, I want to learn so much before. And he stops, and she's like, what were you gonna say? And he's like, before you kill me. It happened to them, it'll happen to me. It's a pattern. And he confirms that the Knights Radiant killed their Spren, and it had something to do with their oaths. And Pattern also tells her that she lives so many lies, but she needs to speak some truths if she wants to grow. And we get another Shallan flashback from 5.5 years ago, and she's pretty catatonic still, and her brother Halaran comes back, and he tells her, I'm going to be gone for a few years now. And he gets into, a screaming match with their father, and he pulls out a Shardblade, and he wants to use it on their father, who's presumably a monster. but Shallan convinces him, don't use it on him. So Shallan present day sees the source of the smoke was 3 caravans on fire. And there's this woman there with these people, and there's like 2 bandit groups. And she tells them, I will offer my protection if I'm able to, join your camp. And then she has some of her men go and help fight, and she turns around her wagon to go towards the caravan behind them. When she gets there, she turns on her acting skills and she's like, oh, thank the Stormfather, you're here. We're under attack. We need your help. And she's obviously speaking to like deserters or bandits or mercenaries, and they're all just kind of like, what? And she's like, gives them a choice. She's like, wouldn't you rather protect than kill? And she also says, I will forgive I'll get your crimes forgiven if you, help me. We realize that Gaz is there. And then one at a time, they all agree except for one of them, but he still goes on to help her out. Important to note that some of her persuasion was her using her powers again. So like her dress turned into this beautiful, like clean thing. Her appearance was more put together. So she looked more like regal and powerful while she was speaking to them. And she asked Pattern about it later, and he says she has the ability of transformation. With the help of this new band of people, most of Shallan's people survive. And then she's talking to the woman whose name is Tyne, and she says, I'll keep offering my protection if you'll accompany me to the Shattered Plains. And Tyne agrees. And then, Shallan ends up talking to the slaver she was with, and she takes the slaves from him. She's like, this is my payment for saving your life. And she offers them money to be her like attendants. And then she also buys a wagon off of him, and then he just, goes away. We go back to Kaladin, and he's going through a high storm with the king and Dalinar and their men. And afterwards, Kaladin tells Moash, like, hey, you've been pulling like double shifts. You should go get rest. And Moash is like, you should too. And Moash convinces him, he's like, my shift's almost over. It'll be fine. You should go on. And so Kaladin's like, all right. And then he goes and accompanies Dalinar. And then when he's alone with Dalinar, he brings up Amaram. He tells him, Amaram slaughtered my men, stole the Shardblade. These are all very high crimes. So rightfully, Dalinar's like, well, do you have any proof? And, Kaladin doesn't really have hard proof. But Dalinar supposedly listens, and he's like, I'm going to talk to Amaram. So after that, Kaladin's talking to Syl, and he's like, see, he listened. And Kaladin's like, not really. I told him stuff he doesn't want to hear. Like, I'll seek my own vengeance. And of course, Syl does not like the sound of that. Back with his bridgemen, Kaladin talks to Shen, the Parshman, and he asks him, he's like, am I really Bridge 4? And Kaladin's like, yes, of course. What do you think? And Shen's like, I think I'm Bridge 4's slave. And then he asks, where's my spear? And Kaladin's like, well, I can't go arming Parshmen. And so Shen's like, then I am Bridge 4's slave. And then Kaladin can't really say anything else because a man runs down from the palace and says that there's been an assassination attempt. Kaladin books it back to the palace, but Elhokar's fine, everybody's fine, Moash is there, and we see that the balcony fell out from underneath, part of it fell out from underneath Elhokar when he went out there. Like some of the railing was sliced with what looks like to be a Shardblade. And when Kaladin's talking to Dalinar, they agree that this was not a super targeted attack. Like anybody could have walked out there. So this is kind of a dumb attempt and cowardly, but I mean, obviously it almost worked. And then Dalinar officially puts Kaladin on king protection duty. They also agree that this had to be an inside job for somebody to have access to the balcony like that. Shallan is speaking with Pattern, and he tells her that the Voidbringers have their own spren, and that spren come from honor, cultivation, and odium. And then Shallan's talking to Tyne, and Tyne's telling her that she wants in on whatever Shallan is planning. Like, she's assuming Shallan has some con she's going to pull when she gets to the Shattered Plains. Kaladin and some of his men are getting horse riding lessons per Dalinar's request, and during this, Kaladin's speaking to some of his men, trying to figure out who was there the night Elhokar almost got killed, and specifically who went on the balcony. So the men are kind of thinking about it, and Adolin comes up and kind of goads Kaladin a bit to try out this other horse that might be more his speed. Its name is Dreamstorm, and this is immediately a bad idea, but Kaladin's stubborn. So he gets on it, and he only lasts as long as he does because of Stormlight, but he gets bucked off, and it's just, it's kind of funny. Adolin, thanks him for not telling Dalinar he was put up to it, but Kaladin knew what he was getting into. And then afterwards, he goes back to that man, and he finds out that Moash was there after the storm, and specifically on the balcony. We go to Adolin, and he is fighting the Parshendi on a plateau assault, and the Parshendi Shardbearer shows up, and they speak to Adolin, and they clearly want to talk to Dalinar. And Adolin says Dalinar would want to hear from them, and so they tell him, don't shoot our messenger when they show up. We get another Shallan flashback from 5 years ago, and there's a lot of focus on her staring at this specific spot in the wall, and it's really bright to her. Nobody else seems to see it, and she says that that's where her mother's soul is hidden. In present day, Shallan is practicing her accents with Tyne, and she has no choice but to play along when these 4 men show up in blue uniforms, and Tyne introduces Shallan as a horn-eater princess. Now, it turns out that this is Kaladin and some of his men, and so internally, Shallan is cursing Tyne right now, but she has to play along, and they have their back and forth, and she ends up saying she's like, great offend, and the only way he can make it up to her is if he gives her his boots. He's like, absolutely not. And then she just starts going off about stolen virtues and all this and that. And he's just like, blasted woman. He gives her his boots. And we just know this is going to be great when she has to see him again in the future. We get a Sadeas POV next, and he's with Amaram on a plateau assault that he is not in rotation for. And Amaram's like not totally, in support of this, but Sadeas is like, oh, come on, I know what kind of ruthless bastard you are. He can't play high and mighty. And then they get the gem heart, and Sadeas ends up tossing it to the High Prince who was supposed to be there. So he has that deniability. Like, he's not doing this for the money. He's clearly doing it just to undermine Dalinar. And then Sadeas is watching Adolin's latest duel, and he's there with his wife, and they're trying to figure out who tried to kill the king. So it's clear it wasn't them. And Sadeas notes that Adolin is purposely fighting with less skill than he really has, and he tells his wife to stop discouraging people from fighting him. Shallan ends up telling Tyne that her scheme is to pose as Adolin's betrothed, and then Tyne tells her that the king from Yakaved is dead, and then they stop for camp, and they're going to arrive in the Shattered Plains tomorrow. We go back to Kaladin, and he is riding a high storm in his sleep again, and he realizes that this is real. This isn't a dream. And the face of the Stormfather shows up again, and he says, son of honor, she trusts you, she should not. You will kill her, you will murder my child, and leave her corpse for wicked men. And of course, Kaladin's saying, no, I would never, but the Stormfather says, you've already begun it, you are human, you will be a traitor. And then he says, I'm sorry, little traitor, he comes for you. And then Kaladin wakes up, and he's with the king and Dalinar and his men, and then Syl is freaking out. We get a cut to Shallan, and Pattern is freaking out, saying, no, no, no. We go back to Kaladin, and he's telling Adolin, get the king, we need to go. Dalinar is woken up, and he comes out, and he's talking to Kaladin about like, why should we go, and Kaladin says it's his instinct, and Dalinar trusts him, and so he's like, all right, let's all go then. Of course, Kaladin's like, I would never, I'm not going to do that, but the Stormfather says, you've begun it already, you are human, you will be a traitor. And then he says that he comes for you, I'm sorry, little traitor. And then Kaladin wakes up, and he's with the king, and Dalinar's in the next room, having his vision. And Kaladin tells Adolin, we need to get the king, we need to go. Dalinar comes out of the room, and Adolin's like, he's saying we gotta go. Dalinar trusts Kaladin, so they all start leaving. They're rushing out of the through the halls, and one of the halls goes dark. Kaladin knows what this means, that the stormlight has been sucked out of the lamps, and then there he is, the assassin in white. So I'm just going to give the highlights, of course, but I will say this is chapter 32, and I highly recommend going back and rereading it because it's a badass chapter. But Adolin, Kaladin, and Dalinar are fighting the assassin. Kaladin ends up taking a hit from the assassin to his arm, and we know when your extremities are touched with a Shardblade, they die. So Kaladin's arm goes all limp and gray. While he's down, Dalinar charges Szeth, and he's like, I'm not going to let you take him, talking about the king. And Szeth reveals, I'm not here for the king, I'm here for you. And then he goes to like swing his blade onto Dalinar, and Dalinar catches it between his palms, like total badass. And then Kaladin uses some stormlight and rushes Szeth. He pushes him into a wall, but it's the wall Szeth used to enter the palace, so they go tumbling, free falling through the air. As they're free falling, Kaladin realizes that Szeth has spheres, so he takes some of Szeth's stormlight and infuses himself so that when they hit the ground, Kaladin doesn't die. And then Szeth, is preparing to finish the job, And then he watches kind of in horror as Kaladin's arm heals itself, which is like not something anybody's supposed to be able to do. And so Zeth is freaking out. He's like, no, like they told me I was a liar. I'm truthless. And then he freaks out and he flees. He flies away. Kaladin makes it back up the palace, and everybody is surprised to see him alive. Side note that Adolin definitely thinks he saw Kaladin's arm get hit by that Shardblade. And then Navani gasps when they look at the wall and they see that it says 38 days, the end of all nations. And then Syl is talking to Kaladin, and she says that something was different about Seth's Shardblade, something about the amount of stormlight he was using. Also, to note, I forgot to mention that Kaladin, when he saw Zeth's abilities, told Syl that he is a Surgebinder, he's radiant, and she was like, no, he's something far worse. No Spren guide him. And then Kaladin's, going over the men who are injured, and we see Havr's legs got hit by the Shardblade, but Kaladin's like, hey, you'll join Rock, you can be a cook, we'll figure something out. Part 2 ends with Shallan, and she's with Tyne, and Tyne is reading her span read, and she sees that there are bounties on the men that are with Shallan right now, that they are deserters. And then there's more information coming through this fan read, and essentially Shallan learns that Tyne was supposed to assassinate Yasna if her ship landed, but I guess this other crew took her out already. And then, Shallan's obviously like, oh my god, during this. And then out comes another message saying, oh, and by the way, Yasna just took on a new ward, and she looks exactly like Shallan. And then Tyne's just like, damn it, because she genuinely liked Shallan, but she's got to yank her now. So they start scuffling. Shallan like fights with all she's worth. Pattern distracts Tyne, and then Shallan also uses her stormlight a little bit to like have an illusion pop up in front of Tyne, and Tyne's like facing away from her. She's like, man, I'm losing my mind. And then Shallan, surprise, surprise, summons a Shardblade and sends it right through Tyne's back through her chest. So she's gone. And then the tent flaps open up, and Gaz and the guys see Shallan standing there with her Shardblade, and she's like, this woman was trying to assassinate me. Bring me anything with writing on it, and do not speak of what you've seen here today. They go follow her orders, and then another message via span read comes through, and it says, your benefactors wish to meet you. Would you like me to arrange a meeting? And at this point, we're presuming these are the Ghost Bloods. And Shallan replies back, yes.